Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this, the Clown Decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And obviously, if you want to keep up with all things Clown Decade, please do subscribe to the channel, and of course become a channel member. And today we're going through a Times Radio segment, where you have three centrist to centre-left, or liberal left I should say, Times columnists, trying to basically understand what reform's appeal is. Now, for those of you that have been watching my streams recently, and I know a lot of you only watch the videos, which is fine, so I may as well inform you, I basically don't watch any alternative media anymore. Load Seaters, I watched them a few years ago, basically watch nothing from them now. I used to have a whole host of channels I watched, Count Dankula for some entertainment. Academic Agent was another one years ago, but obviously I've not watched him in about 4 years. And these days my alternative media is pretty much limited to Chris Williamson, Andrew Gold and Winston Marshall, and whether they have anyone interesting on, ranging from catching up with what Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe are up to, all the way to, frankly, much more interesting people such as Mike Graham being on Heretics the other day, and of course wherever Rory Sutherland is. And I've actually found myself listening to The Spectator's output, the Times Radio podcast I'm actually an avid listener to, for nothing else, just because they're well informed. And I found that alternative media really aren't. But the thing that does get to me is that absolutely nobody on Times Radio seems to be pro-reform. When it comes to Spectator, you obviously have the odd pro-reform person on. Most of them are Tories, but a lot of people are, at the very least, understanding why reform's doing well. And I listen to the Telegraph podcast as well, and again, they understand what's going on. But it's very interesting to listen over to Times Radio, and I wanted to go through this today because it's like looking into almost a dinner party conversation with a few people who are realising that the world where they are at the top is currently collapsing all around them, and they are basically trying to cope their way into a position of effectively denial, and if not denial, bargaining. They are going through grief, and I think it's important we go through it because of that. And as I say, at the very least, they're well informed on this, so let's take a look at what they have to say.
Well, I had a really interesting conversation over the weekend with a pollster who has been doing some work on what a reform voter looks like, and I'd never really thought Nigel Farage was the next Prime Minister, and this conversation rather shifted my view of what might be possible for him, because this...
Oh yeah, this is the thing. Basically everyone I know, even the people who aren't particularly well informed on politics, have effectively come round to the view of, oh, there's actually a good chance Nigel Farage is going to be the next Prime Minister, isn't there? Yet when it comes to Charlotte Ivers here, Times columnist, she is still basically in the denial stage and is having to come round to bargaining.
Guy was saying to me he'd been sending his team away to say, what does a reform voter look like? And they kept coming back and saying, a reform voter looks like the average member of the general public, even on something like gay marriage, for example, which you'd expect maybe reform voters to be different to the average member of the public. No, they were just the same as anybody else, the average member of the public. And
not entirely sure what she means with gay marriage thing. As far as I'm aware, people are basically accepting of gay marriage these days. I don't even think Reform have a position on it. As far as I'm aware, Nigel Farage has only ever said on gay marriage, I wouldn't have passed it, but it's a done deal, so we're not going to touch it. Which frankly is also my position. It's just not worth having the conversation over. It's too deep for some people, I think. But I remember going to the dentist a year and a half ago, and even the dentist and dental nurse were talking about how there were two random people in a park basically loudly proclaiming they'll vote for Nigel Farage. Back then they were saying, that's not the sort of thing I'd be saying in public really, but you know, democratic system and all that. These days, they'd be like, oh, everyone's voting for him. I'd probably actually out myself as a Tory member in front of them at this point. I don't care. But it's just been normalised. Reform support has been completely normalised, and yet when it comes to Times columnists on the left side of the political spectrum, here they are basically still in denial about that.
He had then sent them away and had various models. You know, when you get elections where people say, oh yes, Workington man won this election for Boris Johnson, Mondeo man for Tony Blair, Worcestershire woman. And he had gone to all of those different types of demographics of people and said, okay, what's going on here? And in each case, Reform was winning with those demographics. And I thought, wow, okay, this is quite remarkable. Something is happening.
Yeah, it's actually quite a thing to miss, to be honest, at this point. Nigel Farage and obviously his wider political vehicle, which obviously is trying to make the political vehicle less about Nigel Farage the man and more Reform the team, That's very much what the conference was about. It turns out that given Nigel Farage, anyway, was at the centre of pretty much every political realignment that we have seen over the past decade, has, ended up being the one person that all these people that were giving the Tories 14 years of chances have moved to. Because why wouldn't they? At the end of the day, as I went through in the Tom Nicholas video the other day, he was a man who in the 90s said, I always thought I was going to be a Conservative. Well, the Conservatives left me over the European Union and sovereignty and things like that. And at the end of the day, now you've got Jacob Rees-Mogg saying, oh, Reform's just got a load of Conservative policy. Of course I like them. Oh, and it turns out that that's really popular with the electorate too. Yeah, all these centre-leftists to outright Marxists over in the media, especially in the mainstream, that wanted a united Europe and wanted all the rules very much centralised in Brussels. And it's uncouth for us to still use the imperial system. Why don't we just have a good metric system like the rest of Europe? They're coming to understand that actually they're kind of the weirdos. But this is all their social life is, with other weirdos. So in their mind, they're normal. And I want you to bear that in mind for what they go into later.
And I do think Seb is completely right. They are a party that is way off being fully professionalised, and people may start to notice that closer to the election, start to care a bit more when it really is a question of, do you want these people running your country?
I genuinely think the answer to that is yes. I think the non-professionalised area of Reform really translates from these people to, effectively, they're not what I'm used to. You know, you see a bit of back and forth, kind of publicly, such as the whole Vanessa Frake thing, where she said, you know, some trans women might end up in women's prisons because they're too likely to get, well, don't need to go into details of that, but being not necessarily mortal, but very, very high risk danger in a male prison. So they don't go in the general population of a women's one. They have their own special unit, whatever. She didn't say that outright, but she did clarify that in a later interview. But then a day later, absolutely every MP and everyone at the top of Reform is saying no trans women in women's prisons, because politics is all about vibes. And I think the general public are actually quite appreciative of that, because basically none of these people seem like robots. I really like all the Reform MPs, and even the ex-Reform MPs, because they seem like real, genuine people rather than political robots.
But right now, they really do seem to be in quite an astonishingly strong position.
Well, I mean, that's kind of the crucial question, because Reform at the moment is an idea. It's one man and an idea. And what happens when it becomes more than that? So,
I mean, I'm not being funny, but it's been a bit more than one man and an idea for probably a year now, especially with Zia Yusuf coming in and professionalising the whole thing. I was about to say attempting, but no, he successfully professionalised the whole thing, and there's still teething issues. It's a year old. But certainly at recent press conferences, you know, Richard Tice headed the one about councils and pensions. But Nigel Farage wasn't even at that one. It's the least interesting one because it's such a dry subject, but every time there's an announcement, sure, Nigel Farage is there, and he's starting to defer a little bit more to other people. He's still definitely present, but he's deferring more as time goes on, it seems, which, yeah, is needed. And well, at conference, he made 3 speeches. One of them actually was an emergency speech because they just found out that Angela Rayner had been sacked. But from people I've been talking to at the conference and people who've watched the whole thing, really, it's like, yeah, obviously watch Nigel Farage's speeches, but, you know, listen to Tice's, Anderson's, who's now speaking about welfare. Poaching was good as well. Obviously, Zia Yusuf. You know, it's quickly turned from only listen to Farage, see what he has to say, to, oh, actually, we quite like all the MPs and Zia Yusuf, and hopefully it's going to turn into, if you're interested in Wales and Scotland, listen to the leaders there. You know, over in Scotland, it's Graham Simpson. I don't think they have a Welsh one yet, but they really need one because that election is in 8 months. But the criticism that Reform was basically just a one-man band very, very much was true a year ago. Nowadays, it's still holds some water because there's inertia over that type of accusation, but I don't think it's quite as accurate as it used to be.
So look, let's talk about some of the things that actually happened at the conference this weekend. Here's Asim Malhotra, who's an advisor to the US Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Ancient wisdom teaches us that evil is rooted in ignorance. But what's worse than ignorance? The illusion of knowledge.
Well, he then suggested that COVID vaccines were linked to the King's and the Princess of Wales's cancers as well.
Oh yeah, there's no doubt in my mind. Getting this Dr. Alcim Malhotra, it was definitely a mistake. I've put it down to Reform testing dipping their foot into pushing the medical Overton window a bit, and it seems to have backfired somewhat. I believe party official line at this point is effectively Reform is free speech. He's simply a guest who was invited to speak. He said what he wanted to say. He does not represent party policy, but we're a free speech party, so we let him say his piece. I don't think that's particularly going to fly with the average normie, to be quite honest with you, and only see it as a mistake. But as I say, I think Reform used it as almost a test for how far they could push the Overton window. As it turns out, if you say, oh, the Royals, they probably got their cancer from the vaccines, probably not a good idea. The vast majority of people seem to be somewhat put off by it to some degree, but then again, there's also been people that have listened to Reform since then because they're massive COVID vaccine skeptics. I imagine you'll lose more than you'll gain, but it's an interesting mix. Not necessarily a positive one for Reform, though. Of course, lots happen at this conference, though, but they go straight to the quack.
And of course, and I've just had a message from Harriet begging me not to play this, but sorry, Harriet, I'm going to. Andrea Jenkins gifted us with this.
Oh, I cannot play that because I think copyright might hit me. But yes, Andrea Jenkins, when she came on to do her speech, she was the definition of camp, with a little Union Jack flag on her sparkly jumpsuit, singing a song that she actually either wrote or at least co-wrote, I can't remember. I believe it was actually supposed to be an entry for Eurovision, but obviously she didn't get it. It's incredibly Britpopper, and I see a lot of people saying that this is an American import, which is very, very telling, because these people clearly have never watched anything on television with any friends or family on Saturday night. This is the typical thing you would see on X Factor, Britain's Got Talent, Ant and Dec's Saturday Night Takeaway. It's very, very camp. It's very, very different to what you would see at a party conference, because at best you'd have Maybot trying to dance to Dancing Queen and being just weird. And you're about to get a lecture as to how actually this, as I say, very familiar Saturday night staple is actually the weird thing.
This is the thing, Charlotte. Like, are they just a bit weird?
What I just find amazing about that particular comment is we have literally just gone through a small conversation about how actually it's perfectly normal Brits that are supporting Reform. Really, that is a backwards question. Are we the weird ones for not getting this? And the answer is yes. And the same is true of an awful lot of people on Twitter who were either trying to say that this is American or this is not prim and proper. I can't really believe I have to say this to everyone, but politics has been entertainment for, well, probably forever. But certainly in as far as my reading of history goes, at least the 19th century. Now, in the 19th century, obviously, it wouldn't quite be sparkly jumpsuits and women singing, but it would effectively be political drama for the masses to enjoy. A famous one being the Midlothian campaign run by the Liberals with William Gladstone, effectively doing a whole bunch of speeches around the country, accusing Benjamin Disraeli of neglecting domestic legislation and only focusing on the empire, things like that. Being financially incompetent is another one, given Benjamin Disraeli basically had to marry his wife to get out of debt. And we're living through a political revolution, so why would you not expect to see something different as a result of that? And hell, if you don't like it, guess what? It was half a minute of the conference that went on for 2 days. I think you can get over it.
Because, people want them to be this fresh new voice, fighting for ordinary people. But what if they're just really odd people who think vaccines give you cancer and think they can sing?
Yes, well, as I said, the doctor was a mistake. When it comes to saying Andrea Jenkins can't sing, she was an opera singer, so she can. I would just say ignore the God Save the King section. It was the end of a long day, But I will admit she butchered that.
Yeah, they are really odd people, aren't they? But it hasn't seemed to hurt them so far.
Yeah, a common theme of this video is going to be, that's because you're actually the weird ones, I'm afraid. These are people who write articles and write up opinion pieces for not just the Times, but other publications as well, effectively being a bit snotty-nosed to the public telling them how they should feel, how they should act, and what their temperament should be. You now have the insurgent party Reform throwing on a big show, effectively celebrating how big a two fingers they are giving to the establishment at the moment, and having fun while doing that. And none of these people, literally none of these people, can understand fun in politics. That's why they're calling it weird. Even though, frankly, if you're going to have an insurgency and keep up momentum, you have to have fun. And from everyone I've talked to who went to conference, I unfortunately couldn't make it, that's what it was. It was fun. While at the same time you had speeches, as I say, from all the MPs and other higher-ups at Reform that were informative and hitting the right notes for the core electorate that vote Reform.
And I think people have such a dim view of politicians, and you often hear, people say, oh, why doesn't everyone hate Boris Johnson because he's a liar, or Donald Trump because he's a liar? Well, the public think all politicians are liars, so it's sort of not wildly surprising when someone goes a bit further out on a limb on that front.
Oh, that's definitely nailed it. And another reason that these people hate Boris Johnson is, again, because he went outside of their norms in this media political bubble, and worst of all, the incestuous child political journalist bubble that all these people occupy, and they just do not understand the world outside it, which is really funny because realistically they think they are the people informing the general public, when in reality the general public do not want to listen to these people. The only reason I want to listen to them is because I find it such an interesting psychological study into the minds of people who are basically losing their grip on reality. But really, the thing I find puzzling with Boris Johnson is, why don't people hate him because he let in the most immigrants ever, given that that is the biggest issue at the moment? And, well, I think the reason is because Boris Wave, while it might be a big thing to talk about even in the media bubble, and obviously where it originated, the Twitter bubble, it doesn't seem to have permeated to the normie yet. Which I actually do find quite shocking, because I do hear the Boris Wave turn thrown about everywhere.
And I sort of wonder whether the oddness of these guys won't hurt them too much, because you sort of have a lot of people thinking, well, they don't seem like ordinary politicians. And frankly, I've never liked ordinary politicians. So, much as they might be a bit wacky, why not give them a go?
She nearly got there. She's basically not realised that it's not Nigel and his team being weird, it's them actually being normal and more relatable than your average politician. She's right that the average person hates the average politician, if they're even aware of who the politicians are at the moment. Bear in mind, most people don't even seem to be aware Keir Starmer's in charge of the country. That's how uninformed the electorate is. But even then, when they do know who Keir Starmer is, they just think he's a massive weirdo too. Why does he keep going on about his dad being a toolmaker? Why is he calling himself a hard bastard, as he unironically did the other day, when he's barely even arresting people and putting them in jail? And if people are in jail, they're letting out 20,000 of them. We've got more illegal migrants coming than ever. Why is he pretending to be hard? I don't understand. It's just weird. It was even worse for Ed Miliband, and these are the people that consider those two normal, by the way.
I just find it impossible to get my head around the idea of somebody watching Andrea Jenkins on, Newsnight, and that being a thing that makes them more likely to vote.
Well, it's not really designed to make more people vote. It's not really designed to make anyone not vote for them. It was just supposed to be entertaining for the people watching and who were there. Again, people were saying the energy was very high in the room at that point. Probably because it was effectively like they were in the audience of the X Factor, but this is a political conference. It's not like one anyone's been to before. That's what a lot of people were saying. And again, these Times journalists, they just do not get that. They do not get that people like being entertained, even in politics. This is why Boris Johnson was so popular and won massively in 2019. He was entertaining. Do not forget the political campaign that involved a riff on Love Actually. It was good nostalgia, it was funny, and it made a lot of people vote for him. Especially because Brexit was so high on the agenda at the time.
For Reform.
I think Charlotte is. First of all, everyone in politics is slightly weird to an extent.
Seb Payne, of all people, saying this is very funny. For those of you who don't know, Seb Payne looked like this a year or two ago, something like that. He aged about 40 years simply by being in politics and effectively being assistant to Michael Gove. I can't remember exactly what his job was, but he was one of Michael Gove's proteges. And obviously the Tory party is dying. But again, Seb Payne's just one of these weird people who has now had to fall back on political journalism. And an awful lot of politicians are like that. They either came from, the public sector, were a lawyer, or were a journalist. Boris Johnson, for example. I can't really do anything else. You don't get an awful lot of people who come from the private sector to go into politics. And it's made this really weird bubble of really weird people who are now telling you, the audience, what is and isn't weird, while you more than likely think Reform are the most normal out of all of them. Seb Payne's kind of right. He's wrong in the fact that basically every politician, political journalist, and most people in the private sector aren't just slightly weird, they're very weird. Public sector side might be a little harsh there. I should definitely say mainly people in trade unions and those that are basically in the public sector to do, very political jobs, I'll put it that way.
So there's slightly weird.
And there's a spectrum, and then there's Reform weird.
Yeah.
And I think there is obviously something there. And the nearest thing I've got to this is there was the Spectator's cover feature last week, which was on the campness of Reform. And I think there is something to that they speak to a particular English aesthetic. It's like Carry On films in a way.
Again, I love it. There's a spectrum. Reform's definitely the weirdest, but they are very much riffing on some of the most popular normie television and films in history. Almost like they're actually the normal ones. I'm not even sure how you make that analysis and still think that Reform are the weirdest of the bunch.
But again, this comes back to the question of, is that what you want to actually run your country and to form the next government? And Andrea Jenkins, who, sure we forget, she beat Ed Balls in 2015 and was probably best known for sticking up her finger at a protester outside Downing Street towards the end of the Boris Johnson government.
Yeah, it's a famous picture and a lot of people, again, quite liked it. And again, she won one of the 2 mayoral races for Reform. And this was despite the election being the worst she has ever experienced with all the dirty tricks that were going on. On top of that, in the victory speech, she started saying illegals should be in tents, not hotels. Everyone said, oh, that's terrible, how can she say that? And then Farage doubled down and said, oh no, that's far too weak. We need to actually just deport them straight away. Again, everyone liked that, and here the Times journalist telling you that this is the weird woman. It's just completely out of touch with the reality as far as I can tell.
Look, the fact is, none of this might matter, and Fraser Nelson wrote about this in the Times at the weekend, that the fact is the country is just fed up, and that's why Reform are doing well. And it's not because they love them or because they've got great ideas or because they think they're going to change anything. They just want to kind of it's a howl of pain, and you saw that in the Brexit referendum. You kind of saw it in a way in the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, and this is just the latest incarnation of that.
Yeah, sort of. But the thing is that they would not be as popular as they are if people didn't think they were actually going to change. You'd only really get protest votes when it comes to the election. You would not have them consistently winning polls. They've won 100 as of yesterday. And obviously you would not have them voting massively in council elections, which do actually matter. It may have been a little different with the European elections because obviously Eurosceptics would be organised for that and vote UKIP and then Brexit Party, and obviously nothing really happens there. But they're quite happy to risk voting for what at least they've been promising so far, quite radical change away from torture conventions in the UN, away from the ECHR, away from the Human Rights Act as we know it today, and moving towards a British Bill of Rights, one that will put British citizens' rights above those of everyone else's, which people want. But again, that makes them weird for some reason.
Well, and you see similar, I suppose, Charlotte, with Donald Trump's election. There was this whole strategy from the Democrats to call them weird because they were weird.
No, the problem you had with that over in America, and I've seen quite a few British righties misunderstand this after I've called them weird, is that the reason it didn't work in America is because when you're trying to call J.D. Vance and Donald Trump weird, 2 people who are happily married, have kids, have relatively stable families, Donald Trump maybe less so, and are doing all these rallies with a whole bunch of normal people and hyping them up to vote for them, if you're saying that while you have literal abortion vans outside your conventions, it's absolutely filled to the brim with LGBT people who by definition are weird because they're not part of the norm. You have fetishists all over your administration. One of them had to be fired because he was stealing women's luggage from airports, etc. That's where the problem kind of comes in. You have these people who are on the side of, Keir Starmer, for example, there's rumours that he was having a gay relationship with Lord Ali. There's rumours he's not with his wife anymore. He had his car and house firebombed for some reason by Ukrainian and Eastern European escorts, I suppose you could call them, thinking, why do they know where he lives and know what his car looks like? On top of that, you had all these people saying that women can have penises 2 years ago, and they're the ones calling reform weird. You've got the same problem here. The problem is you're calling normal people weird. The thing with me is that when I call righties weird, they're usually weird righties who are saying David Lammy needs to be deported, and absolutely everything going wrong in Britain is something to do with the Jews. Things that normal people don't particularly like hearing and would effectively give you an eye raise to. Hell, I did a whole video covering that Financial Times article of a journalist who went to one of their garden parties, and I will never forget this. The spread was effectively cheese, bread, and 6 bottles of Coke. If I put that spread out and my mother was coming to my garden party, I would probably be beaten. That's how bad that is. Calling those particular types of people weird, your Curtis Yarvins and, I don't know, let's think of an English example, Ben Habib weird, it's going to stick. You call someone like Andrea Jenkins weird for singing a pop song that was a Eurovision Song Contest entry while wearing a jumpsuit that is reminiscent of the Spice Girls. Yeah, it's not going to work very well. And for some reason, these people are sticking by it. No, the Democrats were completely right to call the Republicans weird. That's why normal Americans voted for them. Morons.
But nonetheless, people it almost sort of did them a favour in the end, because people thought, well, if the people who don't like them are upset by the whole concept of me voting for them, then I'm just going to vote for them.
You're misunderstanding the core point here, though, Hugo, and that is, it was very, very weird people calling very, very normal people weird, and basically nobody brought it apart from your own bubble.
And so, Trump had the same. He's got a sort of a vaccine denier in his cabinet, for God's sake, and it didn't really do him any harm.
Yeah, because it's quite a minor part of the whole health strategy they're going for. You got RFK Jr. Okay, maybe he might be a vaccine skeptic, but you go on top of that. One, it's not quite true. He's okay with some of the big vaccines, like for smallpox, but you don't need the 110 others that they're making them all take in America. Some for sexually transmitted diseases, by the way, like hepatitis. Why do you need to put that in a baby? Anyway, ignoring that. His main points were about healthcare and what goes in your food. His main points, really, the thing I kept hearing was, I want to get rid of a load of artificial flavourings and encourage Americans to eat a hell of a lot more healthy. You can still have your unhealthy things every now and then, but let's, try and get Americans eating healthy again so they don't have to have astronomical bills because they're all obese. Quite a normal take, really, but no, we'll ignore that for the odd vaccine scepticism, which, if you want to do that with reform as well, fine, but I don't think it's going to put people off, because there's a surprising amount of normal people that are actually quite open to being vaccine skeptics. How the whole World War I conscientious objector thing, that actually originated from people being objectors to taking vaccines before World War I. It's actually quite normal to be somewhat sceptical of injecting things directly into your bloodstream. I know that's crazy to some people, but yeah, a lot of people don't like it, and I'm not even that sceptical of vaccines. I say at least take the big ones like measles and smallpox and maybe a couple of others and you're grand, but, do you need a chicken pox vaccine? Probably not.
No, I don't think it did do him any harm at all. It might even have helped him, because behind the allegations of weirdness from the Democrats, I think many people also saw a snobbishness there and a kind of pseudo-intellectualism, which they didn't very much like.
Again, they're talking around the actual main point, which is that it was weirdos calling normal people weird. They can't say that because they're the weirdos calling normal people weird here. What's my evidence that it's normal people? Well, they literally went through it before. Oh, look at all these normal people who voted Johnson and voted Brexit and things like that. They're voting reform now. Oh, but I can't call them normal people because I'm in this entire group where we all have to pretend we're normal. Or maybe not even that. Maybe just do not realise they're the weird ones. And do not realise that people are not going to forget that generally this bubble was pushing that women can have penises just a couple of years ago. And what did it take for them to stop saying that? The Supreme Court asserting basic biological reality. That is weird.
So yes, I think if I were a strategist looking at how to oppose reform, I probably would steer away from that somewhat.
Damn crazy. You kind of all are strategists trying to fight reform, though, and you've just completely failed at that. None of these people want reform in because they basically rely on the Uniparty being in power to keep their own, because they will be friends with politicians and other political journalists. They'll go to the pubs outside Westminster on a Thursday and chat with these people. All of a sudden, they all go, and it's all reform. They won't know what to say because a lot of people in reform will be actually relatively normal.
Yeah, look, Seb, I mean, sort of a more concrete political objection than mine. You've been writing in the Times that if Nigel Farage wants power, he's going to have to ditch the libertarianism. That's interesting. Tell us more about that.
Oh yeah, he's just correct about that. I accepted this a while ago. I have a lot of libertarian instincts, but man, we are not getting that world anytime soon, and you certainly are not going to win on a platform of it. Anyway, I've pretty much gone through everything I want to there. I could go through Seb Payne explaining how Nigel Farage was way more libertarian back in the day, and now these days is having to not lean on that so much, and how that's quite hypocritical, because obviously throughout his entire political career he said politicians don't campaign on things they really believe in. But I think there's a difference on not prioritising pushing that libertarianness and going actively against it, and so far I think it's more the former there. But he's absolutely right. Libertarianism in terms of, you know, smoking in pubs and not nanny stating around gambling and food and things like that, it's just not popular in Britain, and a large reason is because a lot of people associated with poor health outcomes, which puts pressure on the NHS, and that's effectively a state religion. Everyone admits that. So fine, but well, he could get elected in and do all that stuff anyway. I just want to warn you of that. So yeah, I guess with that, it's time to tell you that you should subscribe, like, and comment on the video, along with becoming a channel member and either sending super chats or super thanks in any stream or video that I make. They are great ways to help out the channel. As for shilling, tonight we've got a Tosh Talks on, well, whether we're going through yet another shift in political perspectives. I think with the way we've gone through this particular reaction to Reform doing what they did at the conference, and how they have two moments that the mainstream were, well, disapproving of or found a bit weird, apparently. Yeah, I think we're very, very quickly moving through a political revolution yet again, so we're talking about that tonight. Thursday I'm finishing off Hollow Knight, and then of course videos out as and when I can make them. Right, with that, that's everything I had for you for today. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.